Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. In our show notes, you'll find links to our ad-free premium version, our other shows, and some lovely, soothing merch to make your days and nights sweeter. What are we hearing about today? Oh, nothing much. Just the wedding at the inn. The big day. The day I wrote like 12 episodes about. If you are just tuning in, if this is maybe your first episode, let me say just a bit about what is going on here. I write stories that help you focus on good things, the ways that we are connected to each other, the beauty of nature, and small kindnesses. For over 6 years now, I've told these stories as bedtime stories on my podcast, Nothing Much Happens. And as the years went by, I found that they all tied into one another, that all the stories and narrators lived in the same small town, what I call the Village of Nothing Much. Listeners told me they enjoyed the stories, but never got to hear much of them as they fell asleep within a few minutes of pushing play. So we created this daytime version, and we get to have some fun here with soundscapes and extras that don't really fit in with the bedtime version. Most of these episodes stand alone, but today's is part of a series, and I recommend going back to episode 39 or even 35 if you are a completist, to hear more about the happy couple who are about to say their I do's. And if you stick around, I'll give you some behind-the-scenes details at the end of this episode. Now, before we get started, let's take a deep breath in through the nose and sigh from the mouth. Nice. Let's do it one more time. Breathe in and let it out. Good. Our stories today put the final bow on this wedding gift we've been preparing for the last few weeks. We'll start with the big day, as the innkeeper makes her rounds through the corridors, calming nerves and guiding guests down to the lake. There will be a best hound and a marmalade of honor, and rows of familiar faces waiting for the music to start. After the vows, we'll listen to At the Reception and get ready to feast and dance and raise a glass. Yes, to the couple, but also to love itself. The big day. Just as I was arranging the flowers on the back porch, the clouds cleared and a bright blue sky emerged. I'd had one eye on the weather all day, though I'd had it on good authority that it would be clear and beautiful, and now it was. A perfect early fall day, not too hot, thank goodness, for a wedding. I'd seen guests before sweltering in their finery, attempting to genteelly fan themselves with wedding programs in the midsummer sticky air, while muttering under their breath about why anyone would get married during the dog days. I smiled to myself as I finished fussing with the already perfect flowers and stepped back into the inn, thinking of the dog days for a wedding, because though we weren't celebrating in the heat of the summer, there were more than a couple dogs involved in today's festivities. I thought, in fact, that I had better go check on everyone and see how things were proceeding. We were minutes from our first guests arriving. I took off my apron and hung it in the butler's pantry before hurrying down the long hall and to the grand staircase in the entryway. As I went, I found myself checking each space I passed through, that everything was tidy and polished, yet inviting. I could smell the good wood polish and proudly noted how brightly the windows shone after they'd been washed. Up the stairs and down a long hallway I went, till I came to the door behind which the groom and his friends were getting ready. Nervous, excited energy was seeping out from under the door. I tapped quietly and heard a call to enter. "Oh, you look fantastic," I said to the three of them. They wore matching bow ties and stood tall for inspection. I went down the line, carefully adjusting the pocket square in the groom's jacket, plucking a bit of fluff off his best man's shoulder, and squatting down in front of Birdie the greyhound to straighten his tie. "Best man," I said, pointing to the groom's friend, and I looked down at Bird. "Best hound," said the groom happily. I smiled and pointed to a bell hung with a wire attached to its clapper above the door. "I'll ring when it's time to come down, okay? Should just be a few minutes." There was speechless nodding. I said, "It's all going to go perfectly. And hey, even if it doesn't, as long as you end up married by the end of the day, we'll have done it." They cracked a smile, and Bird yawned, and I left them to their pacing. From there I passed by the ballroom, where we'd be dancing and lifting champagne glasses in an hour or so, and had to come back for one more quick look around. The room was grand, draped with flowers woven into garlands, the stage set up for a 4-piece jazz band, and the corners and window seats heaped with stacked pumpkins. It looked like a fairy tale, which is just what we hoped. I allowed myself one quick twirl and then ducked out and took the stairs again, this time up to the 3rd floor, down an opposite corridor, and to another door. I tapped, again was beckoned in, and found the bride, a friend, 2 cats, and another dog. Again I said, "Oh, you look fantastic." And again I meant it. Dressed prettily, they were ready, the humans and the animals. "I know he has a best hound. So you have?" And let my voice rise in a question. The bride, seated at a vanity, smiled at me through the mirror and said, "A Marmalade of honor." Her orange cat sat licking her paw on the bed beside a snagged and ruined veil, which had apparently meant to be part of the cat's outfit, but had been roundly rejected. Crumb, the scruffy brown dog, had a bow tie matching Birdie's and sat proudly at my feet, ready to be patted and complimented. Beside Marmalade on the bed was another kitty, gray with bright yellow eyes. She lay peacefully on her mom's lap, getting her ears rubbed. This was Cinder, and her mother, a good friend of the bride, had her long hair braided with ribbons, hanging elegantly down her back. As the bride turned back to her mirror, I whispered to her friend, "Lovely weather for the day, isn't it?" She winked back at me and agreed. I again pointed to the bell, said it would be any minute now, that I would ring as soon as the guests were settled. I hurried down the stairs, glad that while I was in my dress and ready, I was still wearing the practical flats I usually wore around the inn. I'd left my fancy shoes in the butler's pantry to slip into just before time to head down to the ceremony by the lake. I traced my way back through the hall and down more steps to find Chef in the kitchen, surrounded by trays of appetizers with a list and marker in their hands. They looked up at me, lips still moving as they recited the order of events for the afternoon. "Cocktail hour by the lake," they muttered, and gestured to each of the platters in turn. "Crispy Brussels sprouts, caper crostini, mushroom rosemary tarts, chili maple popcorn, honey crisp, and thyme vol au vent." "Yes, Chef," I said. They shushed me and turned back to the ovens. "Then here for dinner, pumpkin soup with toasted hazelnuts. We got fresh bread and fattoush, harissa roasted carrots, couscous, and portobello steaks." As Chef recited, they lifted lids from giant copper pots on the stove and cracked the oven to peek inside. Finally, they stood tall, let out a breath, and smiled at me, and then just cake. and we both gathered around the gorgeous 3-tiered delight they had made with the town baker. It was done with a simple white frosting and a trail of real ruby red maple leaves, sugared and shimmering as if coated with tiny raindrops. They circled up through the tiers and then finished on top with a simple sugar craft heart. It was perfect, beautiful, and of the season, simple and romantic. We'd had the dumbwaiter repaired last winter and had already done a few dry runs, not with the cake, but with bags of dried chickpeas and rice to approximate the weight, and it all went up to the second floor without a hitch. I patted Chef on the back. "Well done. Now take off your apron and get ready. I'm about to ring the bells." They nodded, and I left them washing their hands at the huge kitchen sink and went back up the stairs. I slipped into the pantry and switched my shoes, then stepped back out onto the porch and looked down to the lake. The white benches set up at the edge of the water were nearly full now, and I spotted a few designated helpers, close friends or family members guiding folks around through the side gardens and to their seats. On the dock, I could just make out the officiant, a man with a bright white beard and a book in his hands. I waited till it seemed that all our guests were with us, then ducked into the front office. This old place had a system of bells, originally meant to alert servants, to call for a pot of tea in the drawing room or a breakfast tray for one of the many bedrooms. When we'd uncovered it in our renovations, I'd been determined to bring it back to life, mostly because I wanted to hear the bells ringing. Now it was primarily used by me and Chef to scare each other on autumn nights. I found the button for the groom's room and pressed it, feeling the vibration moving through the wire. A minute or two later, I heard them descending the stairs, nervous smiles and Bertie keeping close to his dad's side. What a good boy. I waited till they had made it down the back lawn and to their spots on the dock, where I'd thought ahead and placed one of Bird's big dog beds. Indeed, he pressed his forehead onto his dad's leg for a moment, and then flopped happily down in it. Even from the porch, I could hear the murmur of chuckles among the guests. Back in the office, I pressed the button for the bride's room and went to meet them at the foot of the stairs. The bride was lovely, her dress simple but classic, and I felt my eyes brimming in pure happiness for their whole family. I thought Marmalade might require some wrangling, but the bride's friend bent down and whispered something to her, and both cats lined up like ducklings and followed the women out. Crumb was a bit less focused, and I took his lead in hand. It had taken some doing, but we'd moved the old upright piano from the library down the back steps and out onto the stone patio. The woman who gave piano lessons sat at the bench, her fingers poised on the keys. One of her young students, a boy whose eyes were laser-focused on the music, ready to turn the page for his teacher, ready to play his part in their duet, sat beside her. As the bride descended from the porch, "It Had to Be You" began to play from the piano. I wasn't meant to be part of the bridal party, but now that I had become Crumb's escort, I felt I had to follow along. As we passed through the smiling guests, I spotted the baker sitting next to Chef, the woman who owned the bookshop with her dog Alphabet at her feet. At the end of the aisle, I recognized the woman who'd bought the old house on the edge of town where I picked lilacs. The folks from Weathervane Farm were there, and in the row in front of them, 2 men in matching jackets with their sons and a golden retriever who I'd met on a walk. Clover was her name, and beside them a woman who reached down and patted the dog gently. The mail carrier, with an older gentleman beside her, and in front of them the man who'd helped me find a book at the library. Smiling from the second row were a couple I'd seen at the big house with the labyrinth. And across from them were the folks who hosted the big Friendsgiving party in downtown, and the man who owned the antique store. It seemed The whole village was here. All of us shining our light right at the two on the dock, that we might help fill their cups with familial love and support on this special day. As the bride took her spot and smiled across at her love, Marmalade stopped and sat regally at her feet. Cinder and her person stood a step behind, mirroring the groomsmen. Bertie did not get up. Crumb zoomed, overloaded with all the excited energy he felt around him, and for a minute I let go of his leash and let him circle the officiant and race from one edge of the dock to the other. I was about to catch him again when the officiant leaned down and said, "Why don't you sit here with me, Crumb?" and pointed to a patch of sun at his feet. At once, Crumb came. He sat and thumped his tail against the wood planks, but soon settled, and I found a seat in the second row. We all turned to the officiant, a man I didn't know well, the grandfather of the bride, but his calm, steady presence had the same effect on me that it had on Crumb, and I found myself drawing a deep breath in and letting it out. Weddings are big moments, aren't they? Moments we remember all our lives. And our lives only come with a few big moments. Those very special ones. When you fall in love, when a baby is born, or a kitten found on a doorstep. Here we looked down at Marmalade, and we all smiled indulgently, thinking of her story. When a dream comes true, or a big ambition is achieved. And I want to encourage you, all of you, to feel the goodness of those big moments, the awe and the excitement of them. But I also want to encourage you not to miss the small ones. Most of our lives are lived in small moments. Most of your love, and here he turned first to the bride and then to the groom, will be made up of small, everyday moments. And often those little experiences, handing her a cup of coffee on a chill morning, walking with the dogs in the afternoon, listening to his breath change as he falls asleep. They are some of the most intimate moments of togetherness. As he spoke, I thought of the small moments that made up my own life. Ringing the bell to let Chef know the first guests were sitting down for breakfast. The feel of a heavy room key in my pocket as I walked the halls. The smell of the old wicker furniture on the sleeping porch. It seemed good advice. If most of life was small, to revel then in smallness. The vows were exchanged, a few sniffles heard from the crowds, the older gentleman beside the mail carrier blowing his nose like a foghorn, the old romantic. The officiant ended the ceremony with one more suggestion, this by way of the wise Persian poet Rumi, whose words, written 800 years before, felt just as pertinent as any of today. Sincerely speak to each other, saying, "My dear, how can I be more loving to you? How can I be more kind?" We cheered as they kissed. Champagne corks popped and the piano began to play something nostalgic and sweet. Now we would eat and dance and make memories, big and small. At the reception. Everyone had stayed down by the lake for a good hour after the ceremony. The skies were bright blue, and the air was so fresh and cool that it seemed the perfect place to commence the celebration. I'd gone with Chef down into the kitchen and helped to assemble the appetizers. Their kitchen was so organized that it only took us a few minutes, and the innkeeper and a few others came along to carry the trays and champagne glasses up and out into the yard. We handed them around, and the guests made their first toast of the evening to the happy couple. I wandered through the crowd, talking with friends and customers I knew from the bakery. That is one of the joys of having a shop that so many go into. You get to make friends, to know a lot of people. I mean, there are few things as intimate as knowing someone's coffee and bagel order like the back of your hand. The beauty of the lake kept pulling me away, and after a bit of socializing, I trod out onto the dock and leaned on the railing, letting my eyes skim over the water from directly beneath me out across to the far shore. The surface was mostly still, only ripples here and there from paddling geese or fish jumping, and the smell was that spicy, clean scent like rain in the autumn. I heard rapid scuttling paws on the boards behind me and turned to see Crumb at the end of his leash, running with wild, joyful eyes. He was pulling a little boy behind him whose face was rosy with exercise. Thankfully, my dress had pockets, and I had stuffed them with home-baked dog and cat treats, thinking they might come in handy. I reached for a few of the puppy cookies and squatted down. Crumb screeched to a stop and happily started munching. I gave a few more to the boy, who pocketed them quickly. "You did a lovely job on that piano duet," I told him. He looked down at Crumb and nodded. "I practiced for 2 weeks." It showed. He nodded shyly at me and tugged at Crumb, who followed him back to the yard. Watching them gallop off made me look around for the other four-legged guests. I wandered back into the throng and up onto the porch where some folks were seated, eating bruschettas and sipping from drinks. At the far end of the porch, a small animal pen had been set up, and I was not surprised to see Birdie splayed out, half on and half off a giant dog bed, his eyes closed and dreamy snores permeating the atmosphere. Beside him, another dog I knew, Alphabet, usually just called Elfie, was chewing on a toy, and I reached over the barrier and patted his head. When I handed him a treat from my pocket, Bird's eyes popped open, and though he didn't go to the trouble of lifting his head off the rug, he did blink at me with his huge brown eyes until I tossed him a cookie. I didn't see the cats and guessed they couldn't be trusted to sit on the porch. I pulled open the screen door and held it for the innkeeper, who was striding down the hall with sweating champagne bottles fresh from the chiller in her hands. As she passed me, she winked and said, "We're moving up to the ballroom in 15, okay?" I nodded. I was happy to be helping with the meal, which we would move up platter by platter in the dumbwaiter and serve on long tables set up in the ballroom on the second floor. I remembered that I was looking for the kitties. They deserved their treats too, and started down the long hall that led from the back of the inn all the way to the front. Most rooms that I passed were open and clearly devoid of felines, but then I came to the library and found the door closed and a big, fluffy golden retriever laying with her nose pressed to the crack beneath it. She was crying just a bit, and beside her, a boy stroked her head and talked to her. When he saw me, he said, "Well, Clover wants to see the kitties. She loves cats." "Oh, did you ask Marmalade's mom?" Yeah, she said if there was another grown-up with us, Clover could go in for a few minutes." They both looked up at me through their lashes with pleading faces. "Okay, come on," I said, as if I had even considered saying no. I held onto Clover's leash, and he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The library is one of those rooms that feels magical, like it must have a secret panel beside the fireplace that opens to reveal a hidden passage that takes you through a tunnel out to the boathouse. I've never checked, as I'd much rather daydream about it than find out I'm wrong. It has bookcases full of old novels, and it's lined with photos and little artifacts found during the renovation. There's a huge fireplace with tall irons and polished bronze that look like they could spring to life and invite you to dinner. And there's a deep bay window full of cushions, and on one, sitting primly, was the gray cat I'd seen with Marmalade at the wedding. At first I didn't see Marmee anywhere, then noticed a giant plant pot hanging from a hook above the window, which was swaying slightly. Along with shoots of spider plants, there was, hanging over the edge of the pot, a thick orange tail, and I called out to her and heard a slow, unbothered meow come back from it. Clover, who'd been tippy-tapping on the old wood floors, laid down in front of the window seat, and the gray cat, my young friend told me her name was Cinder, looked down at her from her perch. Cinder jumped down, trusting and interested, and walked right over Clover's paws, letting her tail slide around the golden's cheek. Clover laid on one side, showing her belly, and Cinder sat beside her, stretched out her neck, and touched noses. "Well," I said, "I think that went just about as well as could be expected." I took a handful of kitty treats from my other pocket and stood up on tiptoe to drop some into Marmalade's planter, then piled the rest on the cushion where Cinder had been. I got a cookie for Clover, too, and she followed me back out of the library, loud cat crunches crackling behind us, and sat down beside the closed door again. Her boy took some extra cookies and promised to stay close to her. I heard a rumbling through the walls and remembered the dumbwaiter, the dinner being moved, and dashed up the stairs to help on the receiving end in the ballroom. It had looked beautiful before when I'd helped to set the tables this morning, but now, as the sun was setting and the candles were lit, it was an absolute dream. We would set out the food, and the innkeeper would ring the bells, and we'd all come together up here to eat our fill and dance until we had to take off our shoes. The kids and the animals would fall asleep and be carried out in their parents' arms at the end of the night. Chef and I would pack up the leftovers for guests to eat in their pajamas over their kitchen sinks at midnight, and we would all finally climb into bed and sleep so deep and dream so sweetly of love. My first thought as I read back through these, preparing for the show today, is how hard I worked on that wedding story. How deeply I felt the need to deliver something that connected as many strings as possible. And how much I wanted to balance excitement and nerves with a story that would hopefully still put most people to sleep. I know for most of my audience, and I know this because they tell me so, they don't know about most of my characters and storylines. They are asleep, and they don't really care about who is visiting where and doing what. And it's not out of unkindness that they don't care, it's just that they turn to the show for sleep. And it does that for them, and that sort of ends their interest in it. But some of us are very deeply invested in these characters. And I wrote this for those folks. In the Nothing Much Happens version of this story, I even had a guest voice, a really lovely man named Eric Ireland, who has his own sleep podcast. It's called Listen to Sleep. Check it out. He played the wedding officiant, and I am so protective of my sleepy listeners that I'd never allowed another voice on the show, in case it woke someone up. Well, that's not strictly true. Our dear trusted audio engineer, Bob Wittersheim, has been on one episode. It's our 5-year anniversary episode, another good listen. But my point is, I threw some rules out for this episode. It could be a little exciting. It could have another voice. It was twice as long as any other story I'd ever written. And for the most part, it was lovingly received. People so appreciated that so many of our favorite villagers and their animals were present. They loved that the innkeeper told the story as it felt appropriate for her to walk us through it. She keeps the inn, but really, she keeps the whole village. As an illustration of the negativity bias and how it can screw us up, I'll say that one person, just one person, said that they were disappointed in it. And I carried it deep in my chest for too long. I don't generally read comments anymore. It throws me too far off my game and it just isn't helpful. But it just goes to show how we pay more attention to negative than positive. And trying to balance feedback appropriately is an ongoing process. I'm working on it. And I'd also just like to point out that just because someone makes something doesn't necessarily mean they'd like any feedback. Wow, I have wandered far from the path. Let me digress myself back to the wedding. Here are some random thoughts I had as I reread. I also got married in September. And just like this happy couple, we had a beautiful, cool, bright blue day. I wrote out the ceremony, and my brother, who is a dear friend, performed it. I wrote funny wedding programs that said right across the front, "So, you're going to sit through a wedding." We couldn't be legally married at that point, but decided to do it anyway, just generally being sick of waiting for the government to give us our rights. 2 years later, it was legal, and we got married again on the same day, so we wouldn't have 2 different anniversaries. The way I described the bell system in the inn admittedly doesn't make sense. I own that. The bells would have rung downstairs only. They wouldn't have ever been set up to ring in the rooms above stairs. But what are you going to do about it? The young boy who plays piano has also appeared in several other episodes, and it sounds like he is a special boy who might learn or express himself differently. I love that about him. I asked one other person to play the officiant and was gently turned down. That person was National Treasure, LeVar Burton. How do I connect to LeVar? How do I don't know, have his number in my phone? When I am able to share more, I promise to tell you. Eric Ireland happily stepped in for him and was a wonderful presence on the show. There was a reading of Rumi at my own wedding, but not this poem. Instead, it was the piece that starts, "The minute I heard my first love story, I started looking for you," not knowing how blind that was. Lovers don't finally meet somewhere. They're in each other all along. The At the Reception story was a bonus episode of Nothing Much Happened, so it was only available to our Premium Plus subscribers at first. I love thinking about the ballroom, with long tables lined with candles, and the dumbwaiter rumbling through the walls with dishes ready to be set out on them. And, psst, I planted a seed in this story that is about to come to fruition in this year's Halloween stories over on Nothing Much Happens. I hope you've enjoyed this storyline. I know romance isn't for everyone, but if it is for you, we will definitely hear more from the happy couple in the future. They have that first date planned for them on their new bikes to look forward to. Till next week, I hope you find the time and the space to live peacefully in the small moments, remembering that the small moments are where you will spend most of your life.